Right. I mean, I think maybe a better way to ask the question to me, to put me more on the spot, would be, okay, if we had intelligent aliens and they heard about the story of Jesus on Earth, and they would say, well, I want to believe in Jesus too. I want to follow Jesus too. Am I going to say no?
Hi, this is Josh Swamidass with Peaceful Science, and we're really wondering about Klingons today. If they existed, would they be human too? And in what way would we think about that? And I'm here with Michael Heiser. Michael Heiser is a leading exegete, which means he studies scripture and looks at things from a theological point of view. And so there's different ways that theology has thinking about what it means to be human. So this is an interesting exchange between science on one hand, sort of, right? But maybe science fiction, like the possibility of what could be, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a good breeding ground for science too, you know?
Well, it is. You know, right now there isn't, we haven't discovered intelligent life on any other planet but the Earth, right? But we're discovering more and more exoplanets. So exoplanets are planets that orbit other stars, right, across the galaxy. And it's just an open question about whether or not any of these could actually be habitable for intelligent life, and if we find intelligent life there. And the fact that we're finding so many exoplanets, there's about, on average, they say about one exoplanet per star. So there's about as many exoplanets, or maybe more exoplanets, as there are stars in the sky. Mm-hmm. And so that really wasn't something we didn't know really before, but that really seems to increase the possibility, at least, that there's more planets, more opportunities, so maybe that's there. So we're wondering about that. Now, of course, we haven't discovered that, but people have been thinking about it for a really, really long time, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's think about that a little bit here together. So if we go to, oh, sorry, not there. So we're talking about Klingons as an archetype of the alien. And so there's some particular things about Klingons that are worth discussing. So they have a home world here. Like I said, we're kind of learning more about exoplanets. That's more believable. That's Kronos. That's their home world. Mm-hmm. They're also really like us in a lot of ways. These are like different depictions of Klingons through the ages until the really recent ones, right? They look really a lot like us in the sense they have two arms, two legs. They have a head that looks a lot like ours, but it's also really different. And they have a different origin. It's not like we all share a common ancestor with them, right? So if Klingons existed in that world, they really had a separate origin, right? And one of the strangest things about them, it turns out, is that they can interbreed. So this is a human Klingon hybrid from the Voyager series, right? Mm-hmm. And there's several hybrids throughout the Star Trek universe. But I remember growing up knowing a little bit about biology. This was like the most fantastical thing about it. Now, of course, you could pick on them for having faster than light travel, but maybe there's physics out there that makes sense of that, right? Mm-hmm. But the way how biology works, it's really stunning to think that two species that arose from different planets could ever interbreed. We don't even know for sure if aliens on other planets would have DNA, for example, and how would they interbreed if they weren't DNA based, or if they weren't carbon based, how would they interbreed? We don't really have any sense of that. But in this world, apparently somehow there's a way for them to interbreed, which raises really interesting questions. And and throughout the series, they use that often as a metaphor of race, of two different races coming together. And of course, we know that that's like a really backwards view of race too, because different human races don't have different origins. They're not really defined biologically that way. But that ended up becoming one of the key literary devices they used to really examine questions on race as well. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at Klingons, the idea of intelligent aliens, right? If we ever encounter them and they looked a lot like us, and maybe we could even interbreed with them. They have literature, art, and poetry. They have all that sort of stuff. They seem to have different values than us and different proclivities to some extent. are they human? How do you think about that?
Well, if they're Klingon, they're not human.
Well, okay, so they're not human in some ways. So like they're not Homo sapiens, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that the first part was easy. You know,
But they're human-like. They have like a very high degree of humanness. Like a Catholic would say they have a rational soul. And so a person like William Lane Craig, I mean, they meet his definition of human.
well, that's we'll put that in Craig's win column. Then, you know, in our last talk about Neanderthal, you used the phrase, and it's from your book, obviously, but maybe this is a different kind of human. Okay, so you have this subset within some larger set, and on the one hand, that's easy to talk about because we're talking about Earth. So I would think.
So we're talking about what exactly? Because we're talking about Earth.
Right. So now we're talking about off-Earth, individuals or life forms and whatnot. So, like I wasn't trying to be flippant. On the one hand, it's an easy answer. No, they're not human because they're not from here. But I mean, you're bringing up this whole interbreeding thing, in the Star Trek universe, the science fiction universe. Of course, it's not unique to Star Trek. So, biologically, you would have to say, in theory, then the Klingon would belong in this subset and would probably need to be renamed. Okay, just for clarity's sake. So, I mean, if such a life form did exist, there has.
So that means you would kind of get rid of the category of human rights, and we'd be talking about.
Right, you'd have to come up with some other nomenclature, to handle this. But that would be driven by necessity, because if they were real and this could really happen, then you have to have some way of describing it, if you care, to describe it, which of course people like us do. So you'd have to come up with some other way, probably some biological term, that would be new vocabulary, so that it wouldn't be confused with the old vocabulary. So does that?
Well, I mean, so the terms in theology I know about. I mean, you can call them rational souls, right?
Well, is that a biological comment necessarily? I mean,
it has to be supported by biology as far as we can tell, right?
I know, but then the question is, could you have rational souls that couldn't interbreed? Well, of course you could have rational.
Yeah. So I think the most plausible idea would be that if there were Klingons, that the idea of them interbreeding would just be fiction. That wouldn't ever happen.
Right. I would think there would. I mean, biology is. I want to say we understand it, but as you understand it.
Well, here's an analogy. Like if you go back to ancient times, they used to think about interbreeding almost kind of like two cups of different colored water being mixed together into a new cup.
Yeah.
But what we really found is that interbreeding is a lot more like a lock and a key, but with a profoundly complicated lock. Of course, you can put a key into any hole you want to, but the idea of being able to turn and unlock it to actually produce another thing is going to require a very, very fine degree of matching between the key and the lock, to a degree that would not be possible unless there was some sort of shared origin or common engineering for that purpose in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, then you're getting over into some sort of design, postulate.
Design or common descent, but in this case, we've ruled out common descent, right?
Yeah. Well, by definition, this is. I have to be a little careful to not come across as too skeptical, because I lean toward the rare earth, doctrine. If that's.
Oh yeah, but there's our universe, right, that we actually see, but we're talking about a fictional counterfactual for a moment, right? So we can talk about what it is in our world right now. I mean, frankly,
the whole idea that there could be intelligent aliens just generally, I'm on the skeptical side. To me, the math argument gets too much publicity, and the people that don't get enough publicity are the people in the science community that are actually in the rare earth category. And it's not.
But as a Christian, don't you? God made us. Couldn't He have made them elsewhere?
Sure.
I mean, so then how do you know what the probability is?
Right. Well, that's a point for me, okay? Because the Drake equation to me is useless and pointless. Okay? And it is, and I'm not the only one. There are whole articles that why the Drake equation is useless, you know? And it is, because if I get to make up all the numbers that go into each element of the Drake equation, I can make that thing say whatever I want. I can make it sing, you know?
Well, yeah, so the Drake equation is this idea about, it just really raises the question of why is it that we haven't seen life if we should expect it, and poses a puzzle. And there's different ways to think about that. But if you think that God was involved in the rise of humans, as most Christians do, even if it happened by evolutionary means, then it really does come down to God's intention, right? If he wanted to have evolved or created in some other way intelligent aliens on Mars, he could have, or like in Proxima Centauri or any of these other planets, like, you know, he could have. And how do you put any probability on that? I guess, how could you know?
I don't think you can. And again, that's why I'm saying that's, to me, that's one in my column. You know, again, I tend to think the Drake equation is basically useless. But on the other side, theologically, there's no barrier to this. And so how can we put a number on it? Well, the answer is we can't. So we ought to just own that. And even if we take God out of the discussion, it's not just a numerical proposition. Okay, you could have, you know, life evolve, develop somewhere else, but there are certain parameters. You know, Ross would call this the anthropic principle.
Well, yeah, that's for life like us, but it could be life that's very different than us, right?
Right, but I'm talking about this whole interbreeding thing, you know.
Oh, yeah. So the idea of that happening, even if it was like a perfect double of the Earth.
Yeah.
And let's say it even came out to be these beings that looked a lot like us. I mean, you could maybe make some arguments from biological structuralism that maybe intelligent life end up having to look a lot like us for certain reasons. That's a possibility. So there could have been a lot of convergence there, maybe. But when you start getting down to the degree of DNA similarity, that just starts to get to be implausible. But here's the interesting question, though, Mike. What happened? So we don't actually have a good natural mechanism to explain that. Let's say that Klingons did come here, and we actually could, against all biological expectation. What would that mean?
We actually could interbreed.
Yeah, what would that mean then?
That would mean that our vocabulary has to be modified. I mean,
yeah, but I think that does imply design, I would say.
Well, I see. To me, that would almost have to, because of the very reasons you're talking about. I mean, yeah,
it'd be the level of that, unless there's some sort of biological mechanism, which of course we could look into, that is just kind of beyond our comprehension right now. And of course, there's a lot of biological mechanisms behind our comprehension, but it seems like it'd be fairly easy to rule this out. Like if we could actually find out that they were DNA based, we sequenced their genomes, and they're really close to ours in ways that you can't explain by function, then my goodness, that would seem to imply that there's a God that exists, I would say.
All right, well, look at the similarity between us and chimps. Okay, even with that high degree of similarity, we don't have interbreeding. You know, so it would take something.
Well, there's some debate about if it's possible, but yeah, you're right, we don't.
But it would take something beyond that, which to me I agree with you. That would suggest some intentional design.
But so what I think is so bizarre about actually the Star Trek universe is that no one ever raises this as a puzzling question. And so, like, at least for the warp. Travel. There's like a story about physics when it comes to everyone being able to speak the same language. There's a story there about universal translators but no one seems to even like question the idea about that, which is really interesting, I thought.
Yeah, I could speculate as to why that is. But...
Oh, I think the reason why actually is because very intentionally, I think from the beginning, Star Trek is really using aliens as a metaphor of race.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they have a very progressive, in a very positive sense, a very progressive agenda. They're trying to normalize interracial relationships. Like the very first on-screen kiss between an African-American and a white guy was Captain Kirk and Commander Uhura, right? Yeah. And that's...
So to wonder about the how would lead to sort of a critique of that, or make it somehow questionable or icky, and you're right. That's not what the show was about. The show wanted to present this as normal. because of the.
Well, it's interesting how they do it, which gets to another issue too. So I kind of pointed out the issue of, B'Elanna Torres, who's like a hybrid, right? And how we think about her, right? And it's really trying to normalize it. But if you notice, in the very beginning, there wasn't any hybrids, right? In the very first series. Mm-hmm. What it was really all about was, and it kind of really was a sign of the time, because it's like in the 60s, right? So you have Captain Kirk, and he's basically sleeping with everyone. When they go to a planet, he seduces a woman there, they seduce him or whatever, and it's an alien, then they go have sex together off screen. I mean, it's not X-rated, but that's what's going on. And no one actually raises the question of is this bestiality?
Right, because there's never any kids, so there's no consequence to it. So
yeah, but it also doesn't have it's funny because when we talk about, for example, the possibility of other types of humans on Earth, what comes up is, well, there's humans and there's non-humans. And if humans interbreed with non-humans, that's clearly bestiality. But then in that world, it was really challenging that, right? It's kind of saying that there's different types of humans that are very biologically distinct. They can have sex together. And forgetting about the sexual ethics of promiscuity outside of marriage, whatever, forget about that for a moment. But just the mere act of it being two different types of human, or one a human and one not a human. One is a human, one's a Klingon, one's a whatever.
Two rational life forms. I mean, that's clunky, but
Yeah, that wasn't actually a problem, and that's actually how it starts, right? So, do you agree with that? What do you think? If there were aliens, would it be wrong for a Christian to have sex with one and get married to one, whether or not they could have kids?
Well, I think biblically it would be, because of the comments on Genesis about the purpose that God had created humans for, male and female, and again for reproduction and things like that. So I think.
So, but what if you could reproduce then? Let's say you could reproduce. Would that change it?
Well, I think it would not change it, because the biblical comments would be restricted to, again, Earth beings, okay, humans. So now you have a rational life form, but it's not human. So if you're looking for biblical commentary on this question, there isn't a whole lot you can look at. But what you can look at, again, is.
Well, yeah, but this is the biblical commentary that I'm looking for, because I think that. Wouldn't it be fair to say, in the context of Scripture, that it's talking about how humans on Earth spread, and it's not really talking about how we engage with Klingons, and it's a fair theological, speculation to say that if we can interbreed with them, someone intended it, and if it wasn't if it was it wasn't part of engineering by some mad scientist.
I think that's actually kind of a slippery slope thought, because. Let's say we get to the point where we can create, hybrids, either through synthetic biology or genetic manipulation.
Well, okay.
Is it really a safe argument to say, well, God made us smart enough to do that, so there you go.
Oh no, this is different. I'm saying that it wasn't a mad scientist that did it. It's just that it is this crazy world where we just find out that you can create natural hybrids, even though it's completely against biological expectation, which implies that there wasn't a design behind it that we can't attribute to any temporal being. It was probably God, as Christians we would say. So then why would God have done that?
You don't want to equate ability with God's design intent. Okay, we have the ability to do lots of things.
But this is different, right? Because this is ability to do something that God could have would have had to specifically engineer, or someone would have had to specifically engineer.
Make a nuclear bomb. Was that God's intention?
No, but that's different, because God didn't have to specifically engineer that.
Well, right, but He gave us the faculties to be able to accomplish that. What I'm saying is you have a logic chain here that can be easily abused, and people are ready to abuse it.
All right, so then, okay, so you think it's actually wrong then to do this. So then what do you make of B'Elanna Torres, these hybrids, and Worf's kids and other people? Or was Worf a hybrid or not? I'm kind of a little bit rusty on my...
Well, what I'm saying is, if you're asking for biblical commentary about, these sorts of things, okay, you have to go back to essentially first principles. You have to go back to creation order, okay? And all of the commentary is about human to human, and it is for a specific purpose. Okay, so there are these boundaries. Again, it's not like you've got an abundance of material to think about in Scripture in relation to this kind of hypothetical. But what you do have can serve as a commentary that can create certain boundaries in which you're safe, okay, ethically safe, theologically safe to play in. The fact that humans could do something that would operate outside those boundaries or jump the fence doesn't justify that thing or make it a coherent argument that God intended them to jump the fence. Because humans can do all sorts of things, and to say they were.
But the issue is, but this is a little bit different. If we had the ability to interbreed with a Klingon, someone had to have specifically made that possible, and it would put a lot of effort into making that the case. Now, so like I said, let's rule out some sort of created being doing that. So it's not like one of the Watchers, or it's not that. So that meant that God actually did that. So why did he do that then, I guess is the question, if it's not for that purpose?
I take the wiring, okay? So you're asking, why would God, I'm going to use wiring as a metaphor. Why would God wire our bodies with the capability to mate, with some.
Well, it's maybe more kind of like maybe it's better like encryption. Like why would he put the encryption key for the human genome in their genomes too?
If that metaphor is preferred, let's go with it. What I'm saying is that other capacities are encrypted into humans that don't suggest that God intended.
I don't know, Mike, because everything you could point to, we could also point to a good use, right? So I don't see any good use for that type of complementarity.
Well, we have sexual reproduction as part of our wiring, or part of our
yeah.
So there would be a legitimate use of that and an illegitimate use of that.
Well, that's true, but what I'm saying is a specific biological capacity to produce viable offspring, when there is no common descent, would require like the equivalent of having like a random key be given to someone else, right? Mm-hmm. And it would take, like I said, it's very easy to imagine species that are very similar that can't interbreed. I mean, that's the standard, right?
I just don't make a distinction between that ability, that created encryption, and other created encryption.
Okay, so that's where you are. I mean, I'm not convinced, but maybe you're right. So then,
well, this is all, fantasy land anyways.
Well, it comes up in Catholic thought a lot, and
well, I would need to know why I should separate that one out.
Well, I'm trying to tell you, like from a scientific side, it's kind of like if you put two people in independent rooms to make a lock and a key, and a lock and a key in another place, mm-hmm. and you told them to make it a really secure lock, right? And they're not talking to each other, and they did not coordinate with each other.
They each have the ability to come up with a way to open the door.
And not only that, it's like the exact same one in both places. I mean, and you can go verify that it wasn't they were passing notes. And that would be the level of surprise. It's like, okay, the key you made there, which you can actually verify, you made a really good lock with a really good key.
Hey, you're using the word made. Maybe you don't want to use that because that's going to play into my side of the argument. Because,
well, I mean, like you could say two independent processes for making, or like, you break a window over here, you break a window over here, and then you take half the pieces from each place and you find out that they actually both form the exact same. I mean, you can kind of reconstruct it.
I think that one of them, or they both have the ability to create a pathogen to wipe out all other humans. Okay.
Well, that's different. No, the whole point is that it's not that they do it separately, but the point is that the key from over here opens the lock from over there, and the key from over here opens the lock over here.
All right.
That is deeply surprising. So the part that's supposed to be idiosyncratic to these two places is actually, or like kind of like very detailed and intricate difference between these two places is actually very detailed, intricately the same. Mm-hmm. That's really what's required for interbreeding.
Now you're back to Mary Shelley with Frankenstein. The fact that we can, does that mean we should? In other words, you're still putting a moral justification.
I think it just does seem that it would be something that is part of the part of the created order, that's possible. So that raises questions too, in a couple ways. So you could deal with it in this conceptual level, but then you would start to see people, even if we concluded that it was wrong to do. And by the way, there does actually end up being an interesting parallel on race on this, right? Because there were a lot of Christians, just like in the 1960s, that were incorrectly arguing that Acts 17 taught that interracial marriage was wrong. And they were arguing, that God set up, boundaries between the nations, and that interracial marriage was a threat to spiritual authority because it was disagreeing with God on that. I mean, this is all nonsense. It's racist, right? But that's what they said. And so then, the initial problem you have now is these interracial marriages, right? But the bigger problem that starts to come up for this theology is how you deal with these mixed offspring now, right? And that would happen here too. So then whatever we thought about it, we can be guaranteed that there will be still hybrid offspring presented at some point. So what do we do with those hybrids? I mean, they are human. They deserve rights and dignity, but do they
I would say, I mean, I'm using this only because of its familiarity. Okay, this analogy. But just as we would, I think, argue well that animals, at least, I don't know that we want to exclude any, but let's just say higher forms of animals. We don't want to use words like rights, but they should be treated well. Okay? They shouldn't be treated in an abusive manner and so on. I mean, we can have those ethical conversations, and they make sense. So, that's certainly not inconceivable if you have products of these, hypothetical relationships, that we should look at them the same way, the offspring, and probably more, because they would have a rationale. The closer they are to us, the more it makes sense for us to treat those individuals or those creatures well, and not just consider them at our disposal, regardless of the outcome and things like that. So that would make sense, to opt, that ethical standard.
Yeah, I think the puzzle then becomes how do we reconcile that then? If you're saying it's wrong to interbreed, but the products of those interbreeding we treat,
things can be wrong for different reasons, and the only reason you would assess something like that as wrong is if you were assessing the interbreeding capability, you were aligning that ability with creation order for humans. Okay, because again, if you're
humans on Earth,
right, if you're looking to articulate a biblical ethic, well, then logically you have to go to the Bible, and again, you've got a limited pool of data there. So the only thing you really have is the early principles in Genesis and the purpose for humanity, and all these sort of big picture, macro level, kinds of concepts and categories. But again, if that's all you have, then that's what you have to formulate your position on.
So then, this is a question that a lot of Catholics have thought about too. It's do you share the gospel with them? Do you baptize them? Do you give them communion?
Well, I would apply the same thing. Why do we even need a gospel? It's because of the fall. What does the fall relate to? It relates to the, to quote S. Joshua Swamidass, the genealogical. If you're out of that loop, then talk of a fall and the need of redemption doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I see no reason why, just because a being is intelligent, means that they are A, fallen, and B, in need of redemption. They could be a completely different category.
Well, they certainly wouldn't be fallen in Adam's sin, but maybe it was a different Adam over there, right?
But why would we need that?
Well, I don't know. It's just a possibility, because they could have been... So they could have been these perfect beings that we meet that are morally perfect, but in this case, Klingons are not morally perfect, right? So,
right, and there's really no, I can't think of any basis why there would need to be any sort of fall and then thereafter redemption on some other world. I mean, that is where the discussion commonly goes.
So what the Catholics say, I think, is that they don't really know, but if they asked to be baptized, they would baptize them. If they asked to take communion, they would let them. That's what they say.
Right, and again, that's the logical thing for a Roman Catholic to do, because they're linking the act of baptism with, the taking care of original sin.
Well, I think what's good about it is it kind of supposes that, okay, well, we'll have to tell them the story of how God has interacted with our people, and we'll observe how God works in them and how they respond, and we're not going to...
My view is that maybe I shouldn't say my view, but the one I like the most, that I think makes the most sense, but I have no idea if it's right. I don't think that Colossians chapter 1, when it talks about the reconciliation of all things, I don't think that is language that specifically aims for a redemptive act in terms of salvation. In other words, absolving a moral guilt problem. I think rather, and I'm with most commentators here, so this isn't new to me, I think rather what's going on in Colossians when the reconciliation of all things extends to the cosmos is that essentially it's hitting the reset button. It has nothing to do with those who didn't avail themselves of the plan of salvation or redemption. And what that means in practical terms is if you're an animal or some other organism or some other rational being living on some other world that isn't part of the drama that's being played out on Earth in terms of sin and redemption, you're probably going to be in the next world too. In other words, it's reset to an original state, an original set of conditions, set of relationships to God, whatever that relationship of the Klingon to God was. Well, then it's there and it's sort of solidified in its optimal perfection, at the reset button. So there's really no issue of Klingons, needing, or it might end up in hell or heaven or annihilation or whatever it is. The individual eschatology question really isn't germane. So you wouldn't like wonder like what happens in Chronicles of Narnia, that there's Aslan there by another name, but it's still him. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't like be wondering, did God incarnate with them? I mean, maybe not, but maybe he did. We don't know. It feels like you're conflating Paralandra with the Chronicles of Narnia on that point. So I don't know that Lewis is doing that in the Chronicles of Narnia to make the Paralandra point.
Oh no, it's different. That's a different universe versus a different planet within our universe. So it is different. So I'm not conflating it, but I'm just wondering. I mean, I would want to know more. I would be curious about that. I would be attentive to it. Just not knowing what to expect.
Right. I mean, I think maybe a better way to ask the question to me, to put me more on the spot, would be, okay, if we had intelligent aliens and they heard about the story of Jesus on Earth and they would say, well, I want to believe in Jesus too. I want to follow Jesus too. Am I going to say no? And the answer is no, I wouldn't say that, because theologically, I'd have to ask, okay, is that prompted? And by the way, I'd be almost inhuman if I actually sat down and thought about this way, okay? But I'm just unpacking it. Does my theology, make me look at the alien asking this question as, well, that's just intellectual curiosity, as opposed to they're being drawn by the Spirit? Because if it's the latter, then you got to give them the gospel, because you don't know what God is up to.
Well, that's my point. I think that there's I think if we ever encountered intelligent aliens, I think it wouldn't be the same. Maybe it'd be even more dramatic, or maybe it'd be less dramatic. I don't know, but it would be the same sort of theological reckoning that we'd be working through to understand how to engage this new people that happened when the Gentiles were brought into the early church, of just figuring out, like, how does God's grace work with these people, and not knowing and having to sort that out.
I mean, there's something of an analogy there, but in the Gentile story, it's, the nations have been put under judgment, and a Jew is going to know that. And so they're going to look at them negatively for that reason. But even that's the
yeah, there is differences.
Yeah, right. I would agree that there's there's something of an analogy there to be had.
Yeah, because you have like Cornelius. I think what's really interesting is how empirically they figure parts of this out. Because you have like Peter getting a vision from God, and then God actually says him to go see Cornelius, right? And so it's not like this abstract debate about what to do with Gentiles. He's kind of confronted with this reality of seeing Gentiles speaking in tongues and worshiping Jesus and trying to make sense of that. And so it's that reality that completely shifts it. And it's kind of basically he's seeing what God's doing there. Yeah. And I can imagine
the disconnect there is that we could have popped in, we could time travel and pop back into that scene when Peter's getting the vision and saying, Peter, you idiot, you should have known this from your Old Testament. Okay, so there's still that. But you're right, they do have to be awakened because they've been blinded negatively by their own religious community and less negatively just by the trauma of the exile. They don't think about the Gentiles in that way anymore.
Yeah, so you could imagine how I could see a scenario where we kind of come for theoretical reasons to think that one thing about these Klingons, and then, as we're visiting Kronos or something like that, we find that there's like this group of Klingons like worshiping Jesus and following him. We're like, well, wait a minute, maybe we misread this. And
are you familiar with a couple of the passages that might be, and again I stress might be, used to justify the existence of other worlds?
Oh yeah, so let's get to that, because a lot of people think this is a dumb conversation to have because Scripture is clear in their minds that there are no intelligent aliens because Scripture doesn't mention them, and like that's a common young Earth creationist view. Because like if you really want to have all of the answers, if there are Klingons, if there are intelligent aliens, we don't have all the answers. And Scripture doesn't talk about it. Is that a good argument? And how does that fit with Christian tradition? Do we know from the Bible somehow that there are no intelligent aliens?
I would say no, we don't. I don't think there's any specific commentary. There are a couple of passages. I'm only going to refer to one because the issue is the same word in both. Okay, so in Hebrews 11 it says, I'll just start in the first verse. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that and ESV has universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen is not made out of things that are visible. Well, the word the ESV translates as universe there is ion, okay, that's the Greek lemma, and it's plural.
Oh, and the ion is in the worlds.
You could very legitimately translate that. By faith we understand that the worlds were created by the word of God. Now, and there's one other verse that uses the same kind of language, same lemma. Now, in terms of Greek grammar, there are certainly, you can certainly justify the conclusion that the plural is at times used to not indicate.
But that's not cosmos. Is it? Is like maybe terms of like the realms? God created the realms, or
inhabited worlds. When we talk about other worlds, we're not talking necessarily about other universes. We're talking about other planets within the cosmos. So it's the same kind of discussion, and this, believe it or not, the first place I came across this was in reading theosophical writings. Okay.
Who? What?
Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky. Again, it was an esoteric occult movement in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Blavatsky was strange, but theosophy is still sort of a thing. It's a major esoteric tradition, and she had her own sort of self-styled history of the universes that she wrote. It was widely published during the late 19th century, and this is one of the verses, one of a couple that she used to say, well, the Bible teaches this idea of multiple worlds and eons of time, and she married that to what she called a root racist theory, which wasn't necessarily racist, but it was about different epochs of.
All right, so I think we're digressing a bit here. One thing you've told me that was surprising is that there were periods in church history where people thought I don't know if it was heretical, but they thought it was, that we have to allow for the possibility of God creating life on other planets, or that somehow limits God or something, right?
Yeah,
Can you?
for a long time, typically in the Middle Ages, through a different set of circumstances, and it's not just the Copernican revolution, it predates that, okay? There was this notion that to limit God to one world was to impinge on his omnipotence. And so once those two doctrinal thoughts were married, out of that, the principle of plenitude is what it's called, which is actually older than this, but this is how it got applied. So
this isn't the Catholic tradition, Orthodox, or?
No, it's mostly, it's a Catholic tradition. There other, Islam doesn't have a problem with other worlds. Mormonism didn't, as sort of an offshoot of, Christianity.
So the idea is that because God's omnipotent, we kind of expect him to have made other worlds. And do they imagine these other worlds around other stars, or
well,
or how
once you entered once you got rid of a geocentric system, then thoughts like that started to take shape. People started to reimagine how this could work. Now, the reformers didn't like it precisely because of the atonement question. Okay, but
when you say didn't like it, did they condemn it? Did they just get squeezy about it, or what?
Not all of them, but the majority of Protestants did not like the idea, because to them it sounded like multiple incarnations and multiple ways of salvation and all this kind of stuff. But there were exceptions. Timothy Dwight, who was the president at Yale, was in favor of the idea. Thomas Chalmers, over in Europe, again in that tradition, was a very famous proponent of the idea. But by and large, it had a Catholic majority and a Protestant minority. And there were a couple of things that made it into what it is today that just sort of took the positive vibe away from it. There was Thomas Paine, the guy, the famous atheist, the American revolutionary. He actually used the multiple worlds doctrine to ridicule Christianity, precisely along the lines that the Protestants were afraid of: multiple worlds and multiple crucifixions. He used that as sort of a whipping boy to make fun of Christians.
And so C.S. Lewis responds to that argument in Religion and Rocketry, I think, right?
Yeah. So that it actually set off a big debate, and there was pushback, against Paine, naturally. Once Darwin comes along, and then later the idea gets married to Darwin, and lots of Christians didn't like Darwin. Well, then the interest in extraterrestrial life just plummeted, because the idea got married to evolution. So to accept one felt to a lot of believers like, well, if I accept this, then I'm endorsing Darwinistic evolution, which again isn't the correct conclusion to draw, but that's just where the thinking of lots of people went.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that history. I'm going to have to look it up. But it seems like part of what's going on is there's this real aversion to having questions that we can't answer. I mean, it sounds like there wouldn't be a good answer. We just don't know what the answer would be. But why is that a problem, really, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm with you there. It's just, now the whole thing's sort of inverted. I mean, in the days of the Church Fathers, they were opposed to the idea, but that was really because who among the classical thinkers is defending this? So Plato was opposed, and so most early church thinkers liked Plato. So we're going to go with Plato on this. And so there were different reasons to create the dividing lines, but in the Middle Ages it turns positive.
Well, I think one analogy though might be Antipodeans, right? So Antipodeans would be people who lived on the other side of the globe, and the way how they conceived it was that there was no way to get from the side of the earth that they were to the other. So for all intents and purposes, it would be like aliens.
Terrestrials, yeah.
And they didn't really like the idea, but in the paper response to my book by Ken Keithley, he looked at that and they kind of uniformly basically said, yeah, we don't think Antipodeans are real. But then they found out that Antipodeans were real, and that kind of created a pretty grand reassessment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wouldn't that be kind of similar to what would happen? in a lot of ways if by just brute force we encountered intelligent aliens. I mean, we probably wouldn't encounter them like Klingons per se. We would probably encounter them in the first way and in other ways, but if we did.
I don't think that, to me, that's a yes and no. Because on the one hand, the circumstances, or at least that circumstance, there's an analogy there. There are other things going on in the wake of the Age of Discovery, though, that contributed to the reassessment that you're talking about. The intellectuals of the day not only pointed to finding antiproteans, okay, humans would live elsewhere, but they conveniently had an alternative set of creation texts. Okay, this is also when Sanskrit was translated and found to be Indo-European, in its linguistic, grouping, its features. It's great, man. We can get rid of that Jewish, stuff in the Old Testament and move over to, ancient India. Now we have an alternative creation story here that accommodates, some of these other things. So there were other things going on, but I do think that it's probably fair to say that some of the dynamics would be very similar. You'd start to see discussions that would look, I think, like these earlier discussions.
Well, I think what's interesting about it, though, is, honestly, I'm skeptical about intelligent aliens. And if we did find them, I think that'd be really cool, though. I mean, I would be pretty... I think it would open up just a really phenomenal, interesting conversation in science and in theology and in the dialogue between the two. That would be really fun. And if that dialogue is going to happen it's sometime in the next couple centuries, I'd want to be part of that conversation. Wouldn't you?
Well, I feel the same way, unless it's Independence Day. It just... I'm opposed at that point.
Well, the most likely way we would get it is more through a signature, kind of picked up like a radio signal, that sort of thing, than actually physically seeing them here. Now, I mean, I could be wrong. Who knows? But
well, that's still sort of basically the failure of SETI has made people argue.
Oh, what I mean by that, I don't want to make it SETI necessarily. It could be through the Hubble Space Telescope picking up a signature of, of an inhabited island, and then that has there's a lot, not island, planet, like that, things like that. Not precisely SETI, but I don't know, it would be fun, wouldn't it, to have that conversation?
Right.
For now, we have to settle for science fiction, but it could actually be about the real world.
All things being equal, that if it wasn't, a threat to our extermination, yeah, I'd like to see that. I think it'd be really interesting.
So in science, we have this thing called science fiction, right? Where we imagine counterfactual worlds and play with them.
We have theological fiction too, but it's not the same.
Well, that's what I was gonna get to. What if there was okay, so we have science fiction, but we also have things called thought experiments, and there's a really interesting blurred line between those two, right? There's a real powerful role for imagination in science for imagining possible worlds that gets picked up.
You're hitting me in my soft spot, because I think imagination is essential to doing biblical theology. I'm in the C.S. Lewis camp here, and you know
what I'd love to see from you, Mike? I'd love to see a missive to the Klingon. A letter to the Klingon. What would you tell the Klingon? I would love to see that.
Oh my gosh.
What?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Well, we'll see what happens in the comments, but I don't think I'm going to be the only one who...
Like their planet was just loaded with pugs or something. You just bring all the pugs here that you can. No, I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah, but it's fictional, right? But that type of theological fiction, I think, has value because it shows that... well, I think it does a couple things. Let's say if Klingons really do exist and they come here, I mean, parallel to not precisely what Rottenberg imagined, but something like that. I think it kind of prepares the church to be able to engage with that, because we kind of dealt with it as a counterfactual, but that counterfactual has now become factual.
Yeah.
But then even if it doesn't, I think it's fun. It kind of shows a capacity for something which is the best side of theology, right?
I have two novels, and I'm actually working on the third. And in the first one, I get to interject a lot of this, what if they're ET, stuff. I want the main character, who's basically me, because I'd never written fiction before and I had to know somebody. No, really, that's how I approached it. I burnt the first year of my dissertation writing a novel because I just didn't want to write my dissertation. I needed a break. But I did that, to piggyback theological thinking on the back of fiction, because oftentimes you can, when you tell the story, it sticks a little bit more, or there's points of clarity where there otherwise wouldn't be. And I think people, you never know where somebody's entry point into a discussion is. For a lot of people, it's not a textbook, it's not a journal article, it's a novel. So I agree with you. I think it's really useful to get people thinking about certain questions if it's presented in a responsible way from hopefully.
I mean, it's a way to even just train, instead of on conclusions and dogma and doctrine, to think about scientific thinking, ethical thinking, philosophical thinking, and theological thinking too. Like, how would you think about that big surprise?
Science fiction, specifically movies, when I taught theology, for this very reason. And you could do it to teach theology and ethics, especially ethics with Star Trek, because they just went down every issue. They were presented in some way, and again, it just helps sort of frames the alternative approaches to a given topic, by virtue of the characters in the storyline. That otherwise, if it's just a bullet point list of something in a textbook, people just don't connect with it. But when it's part of a story, they can connect better and get attached to the discussion. So I always thought it was really useful, to use that kind of stuff in a classroom.
Yeah, so now I'm still kind of left really hoping that you'll write the letter to the Klingon now, but we'll see. But so that's how you think about it.
What about you don't have this person in it? Or something?
So to summarize, it sounds like there'll be a lot of surprising things about Klingons, in particular that they could interbreed with us to produce new offspring.
That's the big issue, for reasons that you sketched out.
There's a lot of questions about what this would mean for theology, but that actually might be part of the fun. And I guess by some ways they're human. I mean, we'd want them to have the equivalent of like human rights, even though they're not Earthlings. We have to kind of really work through our terminology, right?
Yeah, but the one thing you didn't touch on is, well, maybe they're demons. Demons are intelligent, rational beings too, because half of the church who is into this discussion at all is like us. Oh, that'd be cool. I don't see a theological quality.
Well, I think this is actually where it might be really uncomfortable for Christians too, because it's not like Scripture addresses Klingons, and we'd have to figure out how to do something that was good, that was ethical, that was theologically sound, and all that, when Scripture doesn't directly address it. So some of the ways how we've solved that when it comes to Earthlings, to humans on Earth, wouldn't be the same approach we'd be able to take, right?
Yeah, there's people, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit bizarre because it's an odd discussion for a lot of people, like you said. But believe it or not, the people who participate in the discussion actually do bring a lot of baggage in the Christian world. There's a lot of baggage here. Even though you don't think it's a subject people would think about very often, that's still the case. Because the alien would be the other, okay? And the other, again, because of science fiction, is going to be sinister and evil. And then you have the whole UFO thing with the contactee movement and the abduction, phenomenon, and all that sinister and evil and abusive. It's got to be demons. And there were people not even in the Christian world. Okay, John Keel is the best example, not a Christian. He's the guy who wrote Mothman Prophecies and UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. he was right down the line saying, this is old world demonology. This is who these beings are. So he gets referenced a lot because he doesn't have a faith commitment, to it, but he just had his head in it to such an extent where that was the conclusion he drew. So, you're going to have this whole other wing that it's not going to upset my faith because I know demons are real and that's just who they are. You get some of these other sub-questions into it. It's really going to be hard for people to accept that God could actually create just this other rational life form. Has nothing to do with angels and demons or any of this. It's just its own thing.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. It's going to raise a lot of intense questions, and it'll be kind of across the board for a while. Yeah. I mean, like I'm saying, the best analogy, though it is a limited analogy, is how they were kind of working through stuff in Acts, right? With the Gentiles. It's not the same. You're right. It's not the same, but it has some parallel. I think you can give me that. Another maybe analogy would be the discovery of the New World. That's another.
I think that's actually the more fruitful one, because.
So discovering New World, Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, discovers India, except for he can't recognize that it's not Indians he's talking to.
You have Europeans influenced by these discoveries, and then they begin to draw different conclusions, okay? So the same thing, I think, is already happening within the church at large, and I'm referencing here for people who care about this subject. Ted Peters was a theology prof. I don't know if he's retired now in the Pacific Northwest, Pacific Lutheran, who's written an awful lot on this. And he actually conducted a survey. It's, 15 years old now, questioning whether extraterrestrial disclosure or discovery would present people of faith with a religious crisis. And overwhelmingly, things are trending in the no direction. With each one of these surveys, you have Gallup, you have Roper, you have Peters, that's the trend. And I think the only reason to explain that trend, it's not science fiction. I think it's just scientific discourse about this. And I think just even the role of Catholicism here, they're a bit ahead of the curve for sure. Trying to bring these questions.
Well, I think it's a different approach to faith, and I think it's a contrast for two different approaches to faith. There's like a closed approach to faith, and a closed set, as like Paul Metzger puts it, right, and an open set. And the closed set, you kind of have all the facts, and you know how they all fit together, and any new fact or new thing is a real threat to that closed system, right? Because it means that your closed system wasn't the whole story. Right. Versus the open set is like there's things that you know generally how they fit together, but you also know there's a lot of other stuff there that you don't know, and so you're kind of constantly engaging new things and new facts, and you're dealing with that indeterminacy and that mystery a lot more, right?
And the open, I would say, as a biblical guy, the open approach should be obvious. Well, no, I think for very simple reasons. Nowhere does the Bible state that it's an exhaustive repository of everything that's ever happened or could be known or could happen.
And empirically, we can demonstrate that that's not true. There are true facts that are not in the Bible.
Where's the verse about toilet paper? Where's the verse about internal combustion engines? Cell phone. There's any number of things that just make this obvious. And it's not that it damages the Bible in any way, because the Bible never made this claim. But people assume that because it's the Bible, that claim's like sort of just.
Well, it's kind of like a type of fishbowl Christianity, right? Where the way how you kind of make Christianity closed is by just adopting a very narrow fishbowl view of the cosmos. And if reality is that small, then maybe you do understand it all. And that comes from excluding from consideration a whole range of things. But then, it might even be internally coherent. But then you just end up with really a fishbowl for a world.
I'm one that I'm open to there being extraterrestrials out there. I don't think we have any evidence of that now. A biological claim requires biological evidence. Don't give me a math equation. Okay, that just doesn't cut it.
So I asked you before, if your daughter came home with a Neanderthal, what if she came home with a Klingon? What would you say? Would you be you were okay with the Neanderthal? You were going to just sit down and talk to her about the consequences of that and how to work through that if depending on what Klingons are. But what about a Klingon?
I would say, just be friends. I'm not going to endorse anything more. So,
so this is different. It's not up to her anymore. You're kind of like, I don't really agree with this.
in my limited data pool, to think biblically about this, that would be where I land. So, yeah.
Well, I guess we'll find out. It'll be interesting to hear her take on this. So, Anyways, thanks a lot, Mike. It's been fun talking to you about Klingons. Next time we'll be talking about Cylons.
Oh boy.
Which is going to be pretty fun too, because that's different. It's starting to deal with artificial intelligence, but it also mixes with this idea from another planet as well.
You need a gift from the old Battlestar Galactica, like the thing bobbing across the Cylon's face.
Yeah, are you familiar with the new series?
No, I haven't watched the new series.
Oh, I got some fun stuff to share with you about that. So we'll be talking soon about, what about Cylons? Are they human too?
Okay.